A volley of gunfire tore through the dawn fog, the rhythmic thunder of automatic weapons echoing down the empty alley behind the Sweet Haven bakery. Tires shrieked wildly over the wet road. Then an engine roared and faded into the distance. After that came silence. A kind of silence so terrifying it felt suffocating, with only the soft, steady patter of drizzle ticking against an old corrugated metal roof. A black Bentley, polished to a mirror shine, now lay canted at the mouth of the alley, its windshield shattered. Bullet holes punched through the door like dark, staring eyes, and from that $1,000,000 car, a figure staggered out. Kieran Blackwood, the name that made the entire East Coast tremble, now reeled like a wounded animal. Blood seeped through his black Armani suit, spreading from the wound at his side, dripping onto the pavement in red trails that blended with the rainwater. His left hand clamped the injury, trying, hopelessly, to stop the bleeding. His right hand still gripped a Glock, even as his fingers began to shake. He lurched deeper into the narrow darkness, his back striking damp brick before he slowly slid down. His expensive Oxford shoes, the kind an ordinary person would have to work a full year to afford, now sat submerged in a filthy puddle choked with trash. On his wrist, a $200,000 Patek Philippe caught the weak streetlight with a cruel, mocking glint, its glass smeared with blood. The undisputed king of the Atlantic seaboard's underworld, a man whose mere shadow forced the most ruthless criminals to their knees, now lay curled beside a trash bin like a dying beggar. Whitmore, Kieran ground out, the metallic taste of blood spreading across his tongue. That old bastard. His mind spun between pain and blood loss. 10 o'clock in the morning, the 10 o'clock meeting. 3,000 people were waiting for him, 3,000 lives hanging on the decision he was supposed to make today. The legalization plan he'd built over 5 years, the dream of pulling his people out of the shadows, all of it would collapse if he didn't show up. Not today, he whispered to himself, forcing his eyes to stay open. I can't die today. But the blood kept coming. The world around him began to blur, bright specks dancing in his vision. Kieran knew this feeling, the feeling of death drawing near, slowly, coldly, inevitably. Then he heard footsteps, light, hesitant, not the stride of an enemy. Through the thinning haze of his fading awareness, he saw a small figure approaching. Not a man, a slender shape, moving with the timid uncertainty of someone caught between running away and stepping closer. "Who is it?" he tried to say, trying to lift the gun, but his arm no longer obeyed. The figure stopped a few steps away. Kieran fought to focus, but everything was dissolving into darkness. The last thing he saw before the black swallowed him was a pair of blue eyes, eyes that were frightened but didn't turn and flee. Then everything slipped into nothing. If you believe that a single moment of kindness can change 2 destinies, if you believe that broken souls can heal each other, then this story is for you. She is a 27-year-old single mother, fleeing an abusive marriage, crushed beneath debts left behind by her dead addict husband, raising her little daughter alone on the meager pay of a bakery worker. He is a 36-year-old mafia boss, cold and ruthless, the man the entire underworld fears, yet carrying in his heart a wound from childhood that no one is ever allowed to touch. 2 people from 2 completely different worlds. Her hands rough from kneading dough, her heart shattered by the past, his hands stained with blood, his soul frozen by everything he has lost. They meet on a drizzling morning, in a dark alley behind a small bakery, and her kindness, her decision not to abandon a strange man who is dying, will pull her into a world of guns, power, and deadly secrets. But the most terrible price won't be her life. It will be the life of her 5-year-old daughter, the little angel she loves more than her own breath. If this story touches your heart, please press the like button to support the channel. Share the video with the people you love, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next moving stories. 45 minutes earlier, when dawn still hadn't had the chance to show itself and the city was sunk deep in sleep, Amy opened her eyes. She didn't need an alarm clock. Her body had gotten used to waking up at 4:45 in the morning for the past 2 years. The shabby studio apartment on the 4th floor of an aging building greeted her with a cold that cut straight through skin and bone, because the heating system had been broken since last week, and the landlord still hadn't bothered to fix it. Amy lay still for a moment, staring up at a ceiling stained with patches of damp mold, listening to the steady drip of water from a rusted pipe hidden inside the wall. This apartment was as small as a matchbox, just big enough to fit an old double bed, a mini fridge, and a tiny corner that passed for a kitchen. But it was clean. Amy always kept it clean, because it was the only thing she could control in a life that had become pure chaos. On the wall across from the bed, Bee's scribbled drawings were taped up neatly like artwork in a museum. There was a picture of a flower, a picture of a cat, a picture of a house with a chimney puffing smoke. But one drawing made Amy's heart sting every time she looked at it. It showed 3 people holding hands, and underneath, in the crooked letters of a 5-year-old, were the words, Mom, me, and new dad. The man in the picture had no face, only a stick figure with a question mark where his head should be. Bee had never asked about her father, but the little girl still dreamed of a kind man who would come and love the 2 of them. Amy sat up quietly, careful not to make a sound. She went to the mini fridge, opened it, and looked inside. A carton of milk half full, a few eggs, a little cheese, and a couple slices of bread. There was only enough food for Bee's breakfast and lunch. There was nothing for Amy. She was used to going hungry. Her stomach had learned to stay silent when there was nothing to digest. Her gaze stopped on a white envelope lying on the table. The envelope she had deliberately ignored for the past 3 days. But today, she couldn't ignore it anymore. With trembling hands, Amy picked it up and pulled out the paper inside. The bold printed words seemed to dance before her eyes like a death sentence. Vince Collections notified her that a debt of $47,000 was due on December 20th. If it wasn't paid on time, they would take the necessary measures. Amy knew exactly what necessary measures meant. Vince had made it clear the last time they met, his eyes sliding toward Bee playing in the schoolyard with a look that made Amy want to throw up. Pay up, or I'll take something else, he'd said. $47,000, an amount that was nearly 3 years of her wages. Money Tyler had borrowed without her ever knowing. Tyler. That name cut into Amy's heart like a blade every time she thought of it. She opened the drawer of her nightstand and looked at the wedding photo lying face down, the glass frame cracked from the night she ran. In the picture, Tyler was smiling brightly, wearing that charming, handsome look that had once made Amy fall hard. How sweet he'd been when they first met. The surprise bouquets, the honeyed words, the promises of a happy future. Then came the gambling. Then came the drugs. Then came the beatings. Amy closed her eyes, trying to drive away the images of nights when she'd curled on the floor, blood seeping from the corner of her mouth, while Tyler screamed like a rabid animal. 2 years ago, he'd died of an overdose in a dark alley, leaving her a mountain of debt and a little girl carrying wounds no one could see. Amy had thought Tyler's death would set her free, but she'd been wrong. His shadow still clung to her through every collection letter, through every nightmare, through the fear in Bee's eyes whenever she saw a strange man. The soft sound of Bee shifting in her sleep pulled Amy back to the present. She went to her daughter's bed, sat down gently, and smoothed the child's soft brown hair. Bee slept deeply, lips slightly parted, arms wrapped tight around a threadbare stuffed bear. That angel face was the only reason Amy was still alive, still fighting, still waking up every morning even when there was nothing left to hope for. "I'm sorry I chose the wrong father for you," Amy whispered, her voice thick. "I'm sorry you have to live like this, but I promise, I won't let anyone hurt you. Never again." Amy stood, took her worn old wallet from the pocket of her coat, and counted the money inside. $23.50. That was everything she had until the next payday. She looked out the window, where the sky was shifting from black to gray, and the drizzle had begun to fall in faint, fluttering threads. A new day was starting, and Amy had no idea that today would change her life forever. Amy had barely slipped her thin coat onto her shoulders when a small, gentle voice called from the bed. "Mom." She turned and saw Bee sitting up, eyes still heavy with sleep, hair sticking out in every direction like a little bird's nest. Her daughter hugged her stuffed bear tight to her chest, those innocent eyes fixed on her mother with the anxious look of a child who'd learned too early to fear goodbyes. Amy hurried back to the bed and sat beside her. "Why are you up so early, sweetheart?" she asked softly, smoothing Bee's messy hair. The 5-year-old didn't answer right away. She just looked at her mother for a moment, and only then did she speak. "Mom, you promised you'd take me to see the Christmas lights tonight. You still remember, don't you?" Amy's heart tightened as if a hand had closed around it. She'd promised last week, when Bee had spotted the poster for the Christmas light festival in the city's central square. Her little eyes had lit up like stars, and Amy hadn't been able to say no, even though she knew the bus fare there and back was a luxury they couldn't really afford right now. "Of course I remember, my love," Amy said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Tonight I'll take you. B suddenly grew very serious, her small face taking on a solemnity that didn't belong to a child her age. Pinky promise. Amy looked at the tiny hand reaching toward her, the little pinky finger as small as a budding flower. She held out her own hand, a hand with fingers rough from kneading dough. With faint scars at her wrist she always tried to hide beneath long sleeves, her worn pinky hooked around her daughter's soft one. And in that moment Amy felt as if the whole world stopped turning. Pinky promise, my B, she whispered, her words like a prayer. Mom always keeps her promises. B smiled, a smile that could melt the coldest hearts. Then she let go, lay back down, hugged her bear, and closed her eyes again. Sleep a little more. Mom's going to work, Amy murmured as she kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering into B's ear the words she told herself every single day. I love you. I won't ever let anyone hurt you. Never. She stood, gently tucked the blanket around her, and then slipped out of the apartment without a sound. The stairwell was pitch dark, the air damp with mildew and the sharp stink of urine. Amy was used to that smell, just as she was used to everything else that was bad in her life. Outside, the drizzle was still falling, draping the city in a pale, hazy veil. Amy stood at the bus stop, huddled in a coat too thin to warm her, watching fine droplets cling to her hair. The bus arrived. She stepped on and found a seat by the window. Through the fogged glass, she saw Christmas lights already strung along the streets. Red, green, gold. The bright colors of a season she didn't have the heart to celebrate. $47,000. The number kept repeating in her mind like a curse. She remembered Vince's eyes when he looked at B, remembered the chill in his voice. The deadline was December 20th. Less than 2 weeks away. What could she possibly do in 2 weeks with $23.50? The bus stopped at an intersection, and Amy looked out without thinking. A sleek black Bentley swept past, elegant and unreal, as if it belonged to a different world. The world of people who never had to count pennies, never had to go hungry so their child could have enough milk, never had to lie awake all night in fear of the knock on the door from debt collectors. Amy didn't know that inside that car was a man who would change her life. A Mafia boss on his way to meet his own fate. The bus rolled on, and Amy sank back into her heavy thoughts. When she got off and walked through the drizzle toward the Sweet Haven bakery, she had no idea that in just a few minutes she would hear a groan coming from a dark alley, and her life would never be the same again. At 5:35 in the morning, Amy reached the back door of the Sweet Haven bakery. The drizzle was still falling in a steady, fine curtain, soaking her chestnut-brown hair until damp strands clung to her forehead and cheeks. She pulled her keyring from her coat pocket, her fingers trembling from the cold as she searched for the right key to the rear entrance. This bakery had been her refuge for 2 years. The place where Maggie had given her a job when no one else would take a woman with dark circles under her eyes and bruises on her body. The scent of butter, sugar, and vanilla drifted out through the crack of the door, a familiar fragrance Amy loved because it stood for peace, for sweetness her life had been missing. She had just slid the key into the lock when a strange sound froze her in place. A groan. Faint, pained, and desperate. It came from the dark alley beside the bakery, where the streetlight couldn't reach. Amy stopped mid-motion, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. Her mind screamed one word at her. Run. Run now. This isn't your problem. The survival instinct she'd sharpened through years of living with Tyler told her to turn her back, open the door, lock it tight, and pretend she hadn't heard a thing. This was not a safe neighborhood. Everyone knew that. Dark alleys could hold anything, from addicts to dangerous criminals. A thin woman like her walking in there would be like a moth flying straight into flame. But the groan came again, weaker this time, as if whoever made it was running out of strength. And something in that sound made Amy's legs refuse to move. The pain, the desperation, the lonely terror of someone dying with no one beside them. Amy knew that feeling. She knew it better than almost anyone. Memory surged like a wave, dragging her back to the nightmare nights in her old apartment. Nights when Tyler beat her with a belt, with his fists, with anything he could grab. She lay on the floor, moaning, begging for someone, anyone, to hear her and come help. But no one ever came. The neighbors heard. She knew they heard, because walls as thin as paper couldn't hide screams. But they chose to pretend they were deaf. They chose to turn away. They chose their own safety, instead of risking anything for a woman they didn't know. Amy had sworn to herself that if she ever escaped that hell, she would never become that kind of person. She would never turn her back on someone else's cry for help, because she knew exactly how it felt to be abandoned in the dark. Her feet carried her toward the alley before her mind could stop her. Her heart hammered, her breathing came fast and shallow, but she kept moving forward. The darkness swallowed her whole, the stench of rotting trash and sewage slamming into her nose. It took her a few seconds for her eyes to adjust, and when she finally saw what lay in front of her, she almost screamed. Blood, so much blood, dark beneath the dim light, spreading across the wet ground. Then shoes. Expensive, gleaming leather shoes, the kind Amy only ever saw in fashion magazines left on tables in hospital waiting rooms. Her gaze lifted, taking in a dark suit soaked through with blood. A hand pressed hard against a man's side, and then she saw what made the blood in her veins turn to ice. A gun, lying right beside the man's other hand, cold black metal catching the weak light. Amy wanted to turn and run. This was the kind of man Tyler used to run with, the kind with guns and violence, the kind who had helped ruin her life without even knowing her name. She took a step back, ready to turn away, when the man groaned again. Rosa, Rosa, I'm sorry. His voice was faint and delirious, calling for someone who was no longer in this world, and Amy understood. She understood because she, too, had called for her mother in nightmares, even though her mother had been dead since Amy was still a teenage girl. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she touched his neck to check his pulse. The heart was still beating, weak, but beating. Still alive, she whispered, and in that moment, Amy knew she couldn't walk away. The moment Amy set her hand on the man's chest to check his breathing, everything happened in a blink. His eyes snapped open, and Amy found herself staring into a steel-cold gray, sharp and dangerous as a freshly honed blade. Before she could even react, his hand had snatched up the gun and aimed it straight at her face. Amy screamed, instinct throwing her backwards so hard her spine slammed into the icy brick wall of the alley. The black muzzle hovered less than a hand's breadth from her, and she could see his finger already set on the trigger. "Who are you?" His voice was rough with blood loss, yet it still carried a terrifying authority, the kind of authority that came from a man used to giving orders and being obeyed. "Whitmore sent you, didn't he?" Amy couldn't speak. Her throat felt clenched shut by fear. All she could do was shake her head wildly, eyes wide, fixed on the gun trained on her. "Is this how I'm going to die?" she thought, "in a filthy alley, shot by a stranger I was trying to save? What will happen to Bea if I die? Will my little girl wake up and wait for me, and I'll never come back?" The man stared at her, his gray eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, as if he were measuring her. Amy knew what he saw. Cheap jeans faded by too many washings, sneakers worn down at the heels, a thin coat that couldn't stand up to winter, work-roughened hands, short nails with no polish. She didn't look like an assassin or a spy, and maybe he saw that too. The gun lowered a few inches, but it still pointed at her. "Don't call the police," he said, his voice weaker now, as if raising the weapon had burned up most of what strength he had left. "No hospital." Amy swallowed, forcing her voice back into existence. "You'll die if you don't go to a hospital." Blood was still pouring from the wound at his side, soaking the ground red. The man gave a short, bitter laugh that never reached his eyes. "There are things worse than death, girl." He studied her for a moment longer, then lowered the gun completely. "My wallet is in the inside pocket. Take it, and get out of here." Amy blinked, not sure she'd heard him right. He was offering her money, telling her to take it and leave. She looked at the inside pocket of his suit, where there was probably a wallet holding an amount she couldn't even imagine. $47,000. The number rang in her head again. Maybe the wallet didn't hold $47,000, but it could buy her time. It could let her pay part of the debt so Vince wouldn't threaten Bea. All she had to do was reach out and take it. He was letting her. No one would ever know. Amy's hand trembled as she reached forward, but instead of moving toward the man's pocket, it stopped halfway. She thought of Bea, of her daughter's clear blue eyes, of the drawing of a new dad with no face. What kind of person did she want to teach her child to become? Someone who stole from the dying, someone who stepped over another person's body for money. If she did that, how would she be any different from Tyler? Amy's hand changed direction. She pulled off her thin coat and pressed it hard against the wound at his side. The man flinched with pain, eyes widening at her as if she were something that had fallen out of another world. "What the hell are you doing?" "Stopping the bleeding," Amy said, steadier than she expected her voice to be. "Do you have someone you can call? Someone who can come help without the police or a hospital?" The man stared at her, and his gray eyes weren't icy anymore. They held something Amy couldn't name. Shock, maybe, or confusion. "Why?" he rasped. "Why didn't you take the money and go? I gave you the chance." Amy didn't look at him. She focused on keeping pressure on the wound, feeling the heat of his blood seeping through the fabric and into her hand. "Because I'm not that kind of person," she said simply. "Now be quiet and give me the number. You're losing a lot of blood." He kept watching her, and Amy felt as if he were trying to read her, trying to find the real motive behind what she was doing. But there was no motive. Only a woman who had been abandoned in the dark and couldn't bear to let anyone else endure that. At last, he let out a pained breath that tightened his features. "Phone's in my pants pocket. First number in contacts. Tell Finn to come to the alley behind Sweet Haven." Amy nodded, took the phone, and called, while her other hand kept pressing the coat to his wound. She didn't know whose world she had just stepped into. But she did know this. After today, her life would never be the same again. While Amy was on the phone, Kieran lay still, feeling her small hand pressing the coat hard against his wound. The savage pain left his mind blurred and drifting, and memories began to surge in, wave after unstoppable wave. 24 years earlier, on a bitter winter night in New York, a skinny 12-year-old boy was curled up inside a trash bin after being beaten by a street gang. That boy was him, Kieran Blackwood, the child his own father threw out after his mother died, the child who'd been living on the streets since he was 10 and had learned to survive at any cost. That night, he'd thought he was going to die. Blood ran from a gash on his head, a rib was probably broken, and the cold was slowly swallowing him whole. Then a voice had sounded, warm as sunlight in the middle of a brutal winter. "Mijo, where does it hurt?" A Hispanic woman stood in front of him, black hair threaded with gray, brown eyes holding something he'd forgotten ever since his mother was gone. Concern, gentleness, unconditional love. Mrs. Rosa Martinez, a poor widow living in a small apartment only a few blocks away, had taken him home, even though she had nothing but a roof and a kind heart. The 2 years that followed were the happiest 2 years of Kieran's life. Mrs. Rosa taught him to read, taught him to cook, taught him that no matter how cruel the world could be, there were still good people in it. Then she died. Kieran didn't want to remember how she'd gone, didn't want to remember the blood, the gunshots, the way her eyes slowly closed while she lay in his arms. That pain was too huge, and he'd buried it deep in his chest along with every other feeling, turning himself into someone cold, ruthless, someone who wouldn't allow anyone close. The sound of Amy ending the call yanked Kieran back into the present. He opened his eyes and looked at the woman kneeling beside him. She didn't look like Mrs. Rosa. Chestnut brown hair instead of black, blue eyes instead of brown, pale skin instead of sun-browned, but the calloused hands holding the coat firmly against his wound, the kindness offered without payment, the care given to a stranger without asking for anything in return. It was all exactly the same as Mrs. Rosa 24 years ago. "What's your name?" Kieran asked, his voice rough. The woman looked at him, vibrant blue gaze holding the fatigue and resilience of someone who'd been through too much. "Amelia. But everyone calls me Amy." "Amy," Kieran repeated, as if carving the name into his mind, and for the first time in 24 years, the steel-gray eyes of the man whose name made every criminal heart tremble weren't completely ice anymore. Amy didn't know where she found the strength to haul a man who stood 6 feet 1 up onto his feet and half carry him through the back door into the bakery. Kieran tried to walk on his own, but his body listed hard to one side, his weight crushing down on her shoulder, until Amy thought she might buckle. But she didn't. She'd been carrying things heavier than she was built for a long time now. Inside Sweet Haven, she lowered Kieran onto a wooden chair in the middle of trays of bread waiting to go into the oven. The contrast was so strange it felt unreal. The sharp metallic stink of blood mixing with butter, sugar, and vanilla. A blood-soaked Armani suit lying among sacks of flour and cartons of eggs. A Mafia boss sitting on the battered old chair Maggie used to rest her feet between batches. Amy moved fast, went to the first aid cabinet, and pulled out clean cloths, a bowl of warm water, cotton, and gauze. She knelt beside Kieran and carefully removed his suit jacket and shirt, exposing the wound. The bullet had gone through his side, leaving a hole that still seeped blood. Amy began wiping the blood away from the edges, her hands trembling but her movements steady and practiced, as if she'd done this 100 times. Kieran watched her in silence, gray eyes missing nothing. "You're used to doing this, aren't you?" he asked, his voice raw with pain. Amy didn't look up. She kept pressing the cotton to the wound, more than I'd like to admit. The answer was short, but it held an entire ocean of suffering, and Kieran understood. He didn't ask for more, because he knew there were wounds you shouldn't touch, memories you shouldn't drag back into the light. Silence settled over the room, broken only by Kieran's heavy breathing and the slow drip of water from a broken faucet. Amy wrapped gauze around his waist, pulling it snug enough to slow the bleeding but not so tight it would make him gasp. Her touch was so gentle Kieran had to close his eyes, because the last time anyone had touched him with that kind of care had been 24 years ago. "I've been in hell too," Kieran said suddenly, not understanding why he was saying it to a stranger. Maybe the pain had stripped his guard away. Or maybe those blue eyes held an understanding he'd never seen in anyone else. Amy lifted her gaze to him, and her eyes flicked to the Patek Philippe on his wrist, to the suit that cost more than a year of her rent. "Looking at your watch, you've gotten pretty far out of it." Kieran let out a short, humorless laugh. "There are things money can't buy, Amy, like sleep without nightmares. Like being able to look in the mirror and not feel sick at the person looking back at you." Amy's hands stilled. She looked at him for a long moment. For the first time, she realized that beneath the cold, dangerous exterior, this man carried scars no one could see, just like she did. They'd both come from hell. It just wore a different face for each of them. The sound of an engine revving in the distance cut through the stillness and yanked Amy back into the present. She sprang to her feet, heart racing, survival instinct screaming for her to run. "Stay calm," Kieran said, his voice still weak but carrying a strange steadiness. "That's my people." Tires stopped right in front of the bakery. A car door slammed. Heavy footsteps closed in. Amy backed up a step until her spine met the bakery rack, her hand gripping the edge of the chair so hard her knuckles turned white. She didn't know who Kieran's people were, didn't know what they would do when they saw her here, didn't know whether she would leave this place alive. The back door flew open with a crash, and a large man surged in like a storm. His head was shaved, his face carved from ice, his hand already sliding inside his coat where a weapon was clearly hidden. His sharp eyes swept the room and locked on Amy, suspicious and threatening. Behind him, another man stepped in, carrying a medical bag, calmer in his movements but no less watchful. Amy swallowed hard, feeling like a rabbit standing in front of a pack of wolves. "Who are you?" The bald man roared, his voice like thunder, his hand still planted inside his coat, ready to draw a weapon. His stare pinned Amy as if she were a threat that needed to be eliminated immediately, and Amy could feel danger rolling off him the way heat pours from an oven. "She saved me, Finn." Kieran's voice cut through the room, weak but carrying an order that couldn't be refused. "Leave her alone." The man named Finn paused. His eyes were still suspicious, but his hand moved away from his weapon. He looked at Kieran, at the blood smeared across the floor, at the gauze wrapped around his boss's side, then turned back to Amy with an expression she couldn't read. "Doctor." Bennett, the man with the medical bag, moved quickly to Kieran and began examining the wound. He worked in silence, the steady hands of a former military doctor sliding over every detail with absolute precision. Amy edged farther back, pressing herself into a corner, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 7 in the morning. Maggie would arrive at 8 to open the shop, and Amy didn't know how she was going to explain the chaos in front of her. The bullet went through. "No organs hit, doctor," Bennett finally said, his tone calm, as if he were reading routine test results. "This girl did a good job stopping the bleeding. If she hadn't, you would have lost too much blood." Kieran nodded, his gray eyes flicking to Amy with a gratitude he didn't speak out loud. "How long until I recover?" Bennett let out a breath and shook his head. "At least 48 hours of complete rest. You lost a lot of blood. Your body needs time to recover. Any strain in the next 2 days could be life-threatening." Kieran clenched his jaw, his face going pale not only from blood loss but from what he'd just heard. "I don't have 48 hours. The meeting with the families is at 10 o'clock this morning." Finn stepped forward, and for the first time worry surfaced on his hard face. "Boss, the ambush this morning was Whitmore's. We confirmed it. 3 shooters, all Preston's men." Kieran closed his eyes, jaw tightening so hard Amy could hear his teeth grind. He wants me to miss the meeting. He wants to prove I'm weak so he can take over Blackwood. Amy stood frozen in the corner, listening to a conversation she didn't fully understand, but understood enough to grasp how serious it was. This wasn't debt collectors or small-time thugs like the ones Tyler used to be mixed up with. This was the world of bosses, of underground empires, of wars that could get thousands of people killed. If the boss doesn't show, Finn went on, his voice heavy, the other families will see it as weakness. Preston will use it to stir things up. It could lead to an all-out war. 3,000 people in the organization, and their families, will be affected. Innocent people will die. Kieran opened his eyes and stared up at the ceiling with a look that hurt deeper than his physical wound. 5 years of legalizing plans will collapse. Everything I built, every sacrifice, will mean nothing. Amy blinked, not sure she'd heard right. Legalizing. A mafia boss trying to bring his empire into the legitimate world. She looked at Kieran, trying to reconcile the dangerous man with the gun she'd met in the alley, with the man now talking about protecting 3,000 lives and building a lawful future. Kieran seemed to feel her gaze. He turned toward her, gray eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting too long. "You think I'm a monster, don't you?" he asked, with no accusation in his voice, only weary acceptance. "Maybe you're right, but even monsters can try to do the right thing, even if it's already too late." Amy said nothing. She didn't know what to say. Her world was a bakery, unpaid bills, and the constant fear of debt collectors. Kieran's world was guns, power, decisions that could shape the fate of thousands. Two worlds couldn't have been more different, and yet somehow they had collided in the dark alley behind Sweet Haven. Kieran suddenly braced his hands on the chair, trying to stand. "I have to go. There's no other choice." Bennett rushed to stop him. "You can't go, Kieran. You'll die before you get there." But Kieran didn't listen. He forced himself upright, face white as paper, cold sweat breaking across his forehead. 1 second. 2, then his legs buckled. Finn lunged forward and caught his boss before Kieran hit the floor, and Amy saw on the face of the underworld kingpin, not anger, not frustration, but the desperation of someone who knew he was failing the people who depended on him. 3,000 people, Kieran whispered, his voice like a dying man's. 3,000 people and their families. I can't let them die because I'm too weak to protect them. Kieran sank back onto the chair, gasping, his face as pale as someone who'd just crawled back from the dead. His gray eyes swept the room as if he were searching for a miracle, and then that gaze landed on Amy, the woman still pressed into the corner with confusion and fear written all over her. "Can you help me with one more thing?" Kieran asked, his voice hoarse, but carrying a kind of plea Amy had never heard from a man with power like his. Amy shook her head at once, her survival instinct screaming in her skull. "I've helped you already, more than I should have. I have a job to do. I have a daughter waiting at home. I can't get pulled any deeper into this." Kieran looked at her, gray eyes so deep it felt like he was reading every thought in her head. "I don't have anyone else, Amy. No one Preston doesn't already know. No one he can't buy or threaten. You're an outsider. You don't belong to this world. And that's exactly why you're the only one who can help me." Amy felt her heart slam against her ribs. She wanted to run. She wanted to go back to her normal life. She wanted to forget everything that had happened this morning, but her feet felt nailed to the floor. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Go in my place," Kieran said, never taking his eyes off her. "You don't have to do much. Just show up as my representative and ask to postpone the meeting for 24 hours. Just 24 hours. Enough time for me to recover and handle it myself." Amy's mouth fell open. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Are you out of your mind? I'm a baker. I don't know anything about your world. They'll tear me apart." Kieran didn't argue. Instead, he looked at Finn and nodded. Finn pulled out a checkbook, wrote, and set the check on the table in front of Amy. $50,000, Kieran said. "A certified check, as good as cash, if you agree. Enough for you to start a new life. Enough for your daughter to have a better future." Amy stared at the check, the number 50,000 dancing in front of her eyes like a dream. It was more than everything she'd earned in the last 3 years put together. It could pay off the debt. It could buy Bea new clothes. It could move them into a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. But then Bea's face rose in her mind, the clear blue eyes, the wide grin, the tiny pinky hooking around hers this morning. "Pinky promise, Mom." "No," Amy shook her head, her voice trembling but firm. I have a 5-year-old daughter. I can't gamble my life for any amount of money. If I die, who will take care of Bea? Who will protect her? Kieran went silent. Amy could see disappointment in his eyes, but she could also see respect. The respect of a man who understood a mother who put her child above everything. Finn had pulled out his phone now, his finger moving quickly across the screen. He was checking something, and seconds later his cold expression shifted, his sharp eyes widening in shock. Boss, he said, his voice tight. She owes $47,000 to Vince Moretti. Amy went rigid, the blood in her body seeming to stop. How do you know that? She whispered, her voice shaking. Finn didn't answer her. He looked at Kieran, grave. Vince Moretti, boss. Vince is Whitmore's. Kieran lurched upright despite the pain, gray eyes flaring with a terrifying recognition. Vince. Vince Collections is a front for the Whitmore cartel. Amy's head spun as the pieces slammed together in a sickening pattern. Tyler borrowed from them, she whispered, sounding hollow. My ex-husband borrowed $47,000 and I never knew. I thought it was just a normal lending company. I thought if I kept paying a little at a time, eventually the debt would be gone. But they're Mafia. Tyler borrowed from the Mafia. Amy's knees gave out. She dropped onto the bakery's cold floor, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. Every time Vince had threatened her, every time his eyes had slid to Bea, it all meant something completely different now. Oh God, she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Bea, my little girl. They've been coming after my daughter from the beginning and I never even knew it. Kieran watched Amy collapse in front of him, and in his chest something stirred that he'd thought had died a long time ago. He remembered Mrs. Rosa, remembered how she'd saved a street kid she didn't know simply because she couldn't turn away from suffering. Amy had done the same for him this morning, and now she was sinking into a mess she hadn't even chosen to step into. Amy, Kieran said, his voice gentler than anyone in the room had ever heard. Look at me. Amy lifted her head, tear-soaked blue eyes locking onto him with desperation and fear. You understand now, Kieran said, his tone slow but steady. Preston Whitmore will never let you go. Even if you pay every dollar of the $47,000, he'll find another way to control you, to use you, to threaten you and your daughter. That's how he works. That's how he built his empire, by turning desperate people into puppets. Amy sobbed, unable to speak. She had tried so hard, fought for so long, believing that if she worked enough, if she endured enough, she would finally escape Tyler's shadow. But the truth was, she'd never had a chance. Help me, Kieran said, and his voice wasn't an order anymore. It was a plea. And I'll make sure Preston Whitmore never lays a hand on you or your daughter. Not because of $50,000, but because you saved my life when you could have walked away. You have my word, Amy. I have never broken a promise in my life, and I won't start with you. Amy sat on the ice-cold floor, tears still streaming down her cheeks. But inside her head a brutal battle was raging. On one side was fear, the survival instinct screaming that she should run, that she should grab Bea and disappear from this city, from everything happening right now. But on the other side was the hard truth she'd just understood, that no matter where she ran, Preston Whitmore would find her. That the $47,000 debt wasn't just money, it was a noose tightening around her throat and her daughter's. She remembered the way Vince looked at Bea, remembered the flat coldness in his voice when he said he'd take something else if she couldn't pay. Now she understood what that something else was. Bea, her little girl, a 5-year-old child with sparkling blue eyes and a smile that could melt the world. Amy wiped her tears and pushed herself to her feet, legs still trembling. She looked straight into Kieran's eyes, blue meeting gray in a moment that felt endless. I'll do it, Amy said, her voice still shaking but carrying a steadiness that surprised even her. Not for $50,000, for Bea, because now I know who my real enemy is, and I can't let my daughter live in fear her whole life. Kieran nodded, gray eyes flashing with respect. You won't regret it, Amy. I promise. Amy looked at the clock on the wall. 8:15 in the morning, an hour and 45 minutes until the meeting. She pulled out her phone and started making calls she knew would decide her fate. The first was to Maggie, the bakery owner, the 58-year-old woman who'd been like a second mother to her for 2 years. Maggie, I'm sorry. Something urgent came up this morning. Can I take the morning off? Maggie's voice on the other end was full of worry, asking if something had happened, and Amy had to fight to keep her voice calm, as she reassured her that everything was fine. It was just a personal matter she needed to handle. The second call was to Happy Sunshine Daycare, where Bea was staying. She asked them to keep Bea until the afternoon, telling them she'd be picking her up later than usual. When she hung up, Amy felt as if she'd just cut the last thread tying her to an ordinary life. She turned to Kieran, her voice thick. "If anything happens to me, protect Bea. She's all I have." Kieran looked at her, gray eyes holding a vow that didn't need words. "My promise." Finn drove Amy to an upscale boutique downtown, one that had opened early for a special request. In her entire life, Amy had never set foot in a place like this, where crystal lights glittered overhead, where expensive perfume floated in the air, where a single dress cost as much as 3 months of her rent. The sales staff stared at her without hiding their surprise when a woman soaked from rain, wearing cheap jeans and an old t-shirt, walked in. But one look from Finn shut them up, and they began serving her as if she were the most important VIP in the world. 30 minutes later, Amy stood in front of a tall mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. A fitted black dress highlighted a figure she hadn't known she had. High heels added a few inches and made her stand straighter, and a charcoal gray cashmere coat wrapped her shoulders like a warm embrace. Her chestnut hair had been smoothed and pinned neatly, and her face had been lightly made up, just enough to hide the dark circles and the constant exhaustion. "I look like someone else," Amy whispered, fingertips touching the mirror as if she needed proof the woman in the glass was really her. "You look like someone who belongs where you're about to go." Finn's voice came from behind her, and Amy turned, startled to see something in the cold man's eyes that was almost approval. In the car, Finn began briefing Amy on what she needed to know. The meeting would take place at the Obsidian, a 50-story hotel considered neutral ground for the families. Preston Whitmore would be there, along with representatives from 3 other major families, Marchetti, O'Sullivan, and Zhao. Her task was simple. Ask to postpone the meeting for 24 hours on the grounds that Kieran had a medical emergency, and under no circumstances reveal that the boss had been injured in an ambush. Finn warned her about Preston, calling him a poisonous snake with the devil's smile, and he specifically told her to be careful around Sloane Whitmore, Preston's daughter, someone Finn didn't fully trust, though he wasn't sure which side she was on. Amy listened, trying to hold on to every detail even as her mind spun with 1,000 thoughts. The car stopped in front of the Obsidian, the black glass tower rising like a beast waiting for prey. Amy drew a deep breath, hand tightening around the phone Finn had given her, with his number saved at the top of the contacts list. "Remember," Finn said, his voice still cold but carrying something else now. "If anything happens, text Red. I'll be right outside." Amy nodded, reached for the door handle, but Finn called her name. "And Amy?" he said. The first time he'd called her by name instead of girl or her. "Be careful." Amy looked at him for a moment, then nodded, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the massive glass doors of the Obsidian. At 9:50 in the morning, Amy stood in front of the Obsidian and felt smaller than she ever had in her life. The 50-story building loomed over her like a giant monster made of black glass, reflecting the dull gray sky of a drizzling morning. Every pane of glass felt like an eye looking down at her, judging her, condemning her. Amy drew a deep breath, fighting to steady the frantic beat of her heart. She pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the lobby, instantly overwhelmed by a kind of luxury that didn't feel real. The white marble floor shone like a mirror beneath an enormous crystal chandelier hanging from a ceiling so high it made her dizzy. The walls were paneled with rare wood that released a rich, expensive scent, and costly oil paintings hung everywhere like an art museum. A front desk clerk in a flawless black suit stood behind the counter with a polished smile, and everywhere Amy looked, there were men and women dressed in wealth, wearing things worth more than everything she owned. She felt like an intruder, a stain on pure white silk. And then memory hit, dragging her back 19 years, to when she was 8. Her mother had worked as a housekeeper in a hotel just like this, and one day she'd had to bring Amy along because there was no one to watch her. Amy had slipped out of the storage room where her mother had hidden her, curiosity pulling her toward the glittering world outside. She'd stood in the lobby, staring up at the crystal chandelier with wide, amazed eyes, feeling like she'd stepped into a fairy tale castle. Then a rough hand had seized her shoulder, and a security guard's cold voice had snapped in her ear. "This isn't your place, kid. Get out before I call the cops." Her mother had nearly lost her job because of it, and Amy had cried all night, not because she'd been thrown out, but because she'd understood a brutal truth that there were places in this world not meant for people like her, people born poor, born low, already marked by fate. 19 years later, Amy stood in a lobby just as lavish, and that feeling was still there, unchanged. She was still the 8-year-old child who'd been pushed out of a place she didn't belong. The only difference was that now she wore an expensive dress and a mask that said she belonged to the upper world. The phone in her coat pocket vibrated, pulling her back. Amy took it out and looked at the screen. A message from Finn. "You're not alone. I'm right outside." 4 simple words, but they hit her heart like a calming shot. Amy breathed in deep, lifted her chin, and walked toward the elevators. As she crossed the lobby, her gaze caught on a woman standing near the front desk. Tall, with long black hair falling like water, eyes sharp as razors, and a beauty so cold it was almost frightening. The woman was looking at Amy, not with the contempt Amy felt from others in the lobby, but with something Amy couldn't name. Curiosity, maybe, or anticipation, as if she'd known Amy would come, and she was watching to see what Amy would do next. A slight nod, almost too subtle to notice, and then the woman turned away. Amy blinked, wondering if she'd imagined it, but she didn't have time to think. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the 50th floor, and felt her stomach flip as the car began to rise. 9:58, 2 minutes left. The doors opened, and Amy stepped into a long hallway carpeted in red from one end to the other. At the far end stood a massive oak door, guarded by 2 huge men with expressionless faces. They looked her up and down. Then one of them opened the door for her. The meeting room was as wide as a stage, with a long, gleaming mahogany table in the center and glass walls that looked out over the entire city. 8 people were already seated around the table, and when she entered, every head turned toward her. Amy felt the weight of their gazes land on her shoulders like stone, but she didn't stop walking. She assessed each person fast, just the way Finn had instructed. On the left sat the Marchetti representative, an older man with silver hair and bright, calculating eyes, and beside him, a middle-aged woman who was likely his wife or an advisor. Next came the O'Sullivan family, 2 brothers with the unmistakable red hair of Irish blood and smiles that never reached their eyes. Across from them sat the Zhao family, an Asian man in his 50s with a blank expression and a perfectly tailored suit. And at the head of the table, sitting in a chair like a throne, was the man Amy knew had to be Preston Whitmore. 55 years old, silver hair slicked back to perfection, pale blue eyes cold as a snake's. He wore an expensive gray 3-piece suit, a massive gold ring engraved with a family crest on his finger, and the smile on his lips was the most terrifying thing Amy had ever seen, because it never touched those icy eyes. "Ah," Preston said, his voice like honey mixed with poison. "Did Blackwood send a girl to stand in for him? How interesting." A low, mocking laugh rippled around the table, and Amy knew the real battle started here. Amy swallowed hard, fighting to keep her voice from shaking as she answered. "Mr. Blackwood sent me here with a message." Preston tipped his head to the side, pale blue eyes studying her the way someone might study an interesting insect. "What message?" "That he's too weak to come here himself. That he's afraid to face us, so he's hiding behind a girl's skirt." A fresh ripple of mocking laughter circled the table, and Amy felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. But she didn't back away. She couldn't, not when she thought of Bea, of that pinky promise this morning, of everything hanging by a thread. "Mr. Blackwood had a medical emergency," she said, steadier than she expected. "He's requesting the meeting be postponed for 24 hours. Preston threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing through the wide room like thunder. A medical emergency. He rose from his chair, and Amy realized he was taller than she'd thought. At least 6 feet, his body still powerful even at 55. Or is he hiding somewhere licking his wounds after a long night? Amy went rigid, her heart slamming. He knows. Preston began to circle the table, each step measured, like the countdown of a bomb. He moved slowly, never rushing, like a wolf toying with its prey before the killing bite. The other representatives stayed silent, watching. No one intervened. They were waiting to see what Preston would do, and Amy understood that in this room, he was the most dangerous predator of them all. "Girl," Preston said, his voice softly terrifying as he kept walking, each step bringing him closer to her. "Who do you think I am? A fool who can be tricked by a bakery worker wearing a borrowed dress?" Amy felt her blood turn to ice. He knew exactly who she was. Preston came closer, only a few steps away now, and Amy had to fight the urge to retreat. His expensive cologne hit her like a wall, heavy and suffocating. "I had you investigated the moment I heard Blackwood was sending a stranger in here," he said, pulling an iPad from his inner pocket and beginning to read. "Amelia Thornton, 27 years old, born in the South Side slums. Mother died when you were 15. No father." Amy felt stripped in front of them, each word from Preston slicing into the fragile armor she was forcing herself to wear. He kept reading, his tone flat, like he was delivering the weather report. "Married Tyler Thornton at 22. Tyler Thornton, a severe gambling and drug addict, died of an overdose 2 years ago in a filthy alley. Left you with a pile of debt and a little girl." Amy wanted to scream at him to stop, but her throat locked. No sound would come. Preston stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the tiny red veins inside those cold, pale blue eyes. "Your daughter," he said slowly, putting weight on every word. "Beatrice Thornton, 5 years old. Blue eyes like her mother. Likes to draw. Dreams of a kind new dad." "No," Amy whispered, her voice shaking, her eyes burning. "Don't talk about my daughter." Preston smiled, a devil wearing a human face. He went on as if she hadn't spoken. "Little Beatrice attends Happy Sunshine Daycare, doesn't she? A small place on the east side, cheap tuition, friendly staff. They open at 7 in the morning and close at 6 in the evening." Amy's legs began to tremble. She had to fight not to collapse. He knew everything. He knew where her child was. Preston leaned in, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Do you know what's interesting about Happy Sunshine Daycare, Miss Thornton? The playground behind the building, where the children go out to play in the morning, doesn't have surveillance cameras. I checked." Amy's eyes widened in horror, tears spilling over. He was threatening her daughter. He was telling her B wasn't safe, that he could do anything to that little girl and no one would know. "You wouldn't dare," Amy whispered, the sound raw, like an injured animal. Preston leaned back a step and shrugged with a fake, casual indifference. "Me? I wouldn't do anything at all. I'm just making conversation." Then he turned to the other representatives, his voice loud and clear. "Still, it's a shame to see Blackwood sending one of my debtors as his representative. Miss Thornton here owes my company $47,000. Money her husband borrowed to buy drugs." Murmurs began to move around the table, and Amy felt the way the others looked at her change, from curiosity to contempt. She wasn't Blackwood's representative anymore. She was a debtor, a poor nobody trying to play important. Preston looked back at her, the smile on his mouth the most vicious thing Amy had ever seen. "So, Miss Thornton," he said, "sweet as honey and cold as ice, are you sure you want to keep standing here? Or should you go home, back to your little girl, while you still can?" Amy felt her knees weaken, and she knew she was facing the hardest choice of her life: run to protect B, or stay and face the monster smiling at her. Amy felt her legs give out, her knees cracking down onto the ice-cold marble with a sharp sound that echoed through the suddenly silent room. She couldn't stay upright anymore. Her body betrayed her, trembling out of control as if she were standing in the middle of a blizzard instead of a warm conference room. Cold sweat broke across her forehead, slid down her spine, and soaked into the expensive silk of the dress she was wearing. Her heart hammered like it was trying to punch its way out of her chest, and her ears rang until all she could hear was the violent rush of blood in her head. Preston looked down at her with the triumphant smile of a winner, pale blue eyes gleaming with pleasure as he watched his prey collapse in front of him. "Blackwood's representative doesn't look well," he said loudly, his tone dripping with mockery. "Perhaps she should go home and rest. Go back to her little girl before it's too late." A few people around the table laughed, and Amy felt herself sinking deeper into a bottomless pit. B, her daughter, a 5-year-old with sapphire eyes and an angel smile, a child alone at Happy Sunshine Daycare, on the playground without cameras Preston had just mentioned. Amy couldn't breathe. The air in the room suddenly felt thick and heavy, as if someone had wrapped a hand around her throat. She had to go. She had to get to her daughter right now. Nothing mattered more than B. Not a promise, not a debt, not 3,000 people. Nothing could be more important than her child. Amy staggered to her feet and turned toward the door, the survival instinct of a mother screaming one word inside her head. "Run. Run to your child. Run before it's too late." She took 2 steps, then her hand shot into her coat pocket and closed around the phone Finn had given her. Her fingers shook so badly she could barely hold it. Her thumb slid across the screen as she tried to unlock it. She needed to text Finn. She needed to send Red. She needed to get out of here right now. The screen lit up, and Amy froze. The wallpaper was a photo of Bee that Amy had set as her background, taken last week when they'd gone to the park. In the picture, Bee was grinning wide, blue eyes sparkling like jewels, arms wrapped tight around the threadbare stuffed bear she never went anywhere without. Behind her was a bright blue sky dotted with soft white clouds, and the afternoon sun poured over her brown hair like a halo. Amy stared at the photo, and tears started sliding down her cheeks. Her little girl, Herr Ungel, the only reason Amy was still alive, still fighting, still getting up every day no matter how cruel life had been to her. Mom always keeps her promises. Bee's voice rose in Amy's mind, clear and trusting. Pinky promise, Mom. Amy remembered this morning. Remembered Bee's tiny pinky hooking around her own rough finger. Remembered the way her daughter's eyes lit up when Amy promised to take her to see the Christmas lights tonight. She'd promised. She always kept her promises. But if she ran right now, if she gave up right now, then what? Preston would win. Kieran would be seen as weak. War would break out. And Preston would never let her go. He already knew everything about her. Where she lived, where her daughter went to daycare, even that the playground didn't have cameras. No matter where she ran, he would find her. No matter how long she hid, he would come after her. Amy had run once before, when she'd carried 3-year-old Bee out of Tyler's apartment into the night. She'd thought running would fix everything, that once she got away from Tyler, her life would finally get better. But she'd been wrong. Tyler died, but the debt still chased her. The ghost of her past still clung to her, still threatened her, still forced her to live in fear every day. And now Preston Whitmore stood in front of her, a monster 1,000 times worse than Tyler, with power and money and cruelty that had no limits. If she ran today, he'd hunt her forever. Bee would never be safe. Her daughter would grow up afraid, the way Amy had grown up afraid. The circle of hell would never end. Amy looked into Bee's eyes in the photo, those clear blue eyes looking back with absolute faith that her mother would always protect her, always keep her promises, never give up. Amy's thumb hovered over the screen. She had typed the letters R and E, only one letter left. One D, and Finn would storm in, and she would be pulled out of here, and everything would be over. But her hand didn't press down. She stared into Bee's eyes in the photo, and she heard her daughter's voice in her head again, bright and full of love. You're the bravest mom in the world. You always protect me. Amy closed her eyes, tears streaming, and behind her eyelids she saw Bee's face, her smile, her tiny pinky hooked around Amy's finger. Then she opened her eyes, and something inside her had changed. The memory crashed over Amy like a tidal wave, dragging her back to the nightmare night 4 years ago. The rundown apartment with damp-stained walls, the stench of alcohol and opium thick in the air, and Tyler standing in the middle of the living room with a leather belt in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot from drugs, his face twisted with feral rage, and Amy was curled on the ice-cold floor, both hands over her head, trying to protect herself from the blows that kept coming. The belt slicing through the air, the sound of skin being struck, Amy's cries, all of it blending into a symphony of hell. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Tyler screamed, every word followed by a lash. "You think you can hide my money? You think you can look at me like that?" Amy hadn't hidden money. She'd only tried to save a little to buy milk for Bee, but Tyler didn't care about truth. He only needed an excuse to spill his fury, and Amy was always the perfect excuse. Then Amy heard a sound that shattered her heart. A bedroom door opening, tiny feet on the wooden floor. She lifted her head, and through tears she saw Bee standing in the doorway, 3 years old, wearing princess pajamas, clutching her stuffed bear, blue eyes fixed on what was happening. But what terrified Amy wasn't that Bee was witnessing her mother being beaten. What terrified her was that Bee wasn't crying. A 3-year-old stood there with a blank face, eyes dry, as if she'd seen it so many times it no longer frightened her, no longer hurt her. Acceptance. Resignation. In the eyes of a 3-year-old, Amy looked into her daughter's eyes and saw Bee's future if Amy stayed. Bee would grow up thinking violence was normal, that women were born to be hit, that love came with pain. She would become another version of Amy. She would find a man like Tyler. She would repeat the circle of hell her mother had lived. "No," Amy whispered inside her head, and something ignited in her chest, stronger than pain, stronger than fear. "I won't let that happen." That night, when Tyler finally passed out from drugs, Amy had grabbed Bea and run. She had no money, no plan, nowhere to go. She had only her daughter in her arms, and a vow in her heart that she would never let Bea see that again, never let anyone hurt her little girl. The bright light of the conference room yanked Amy back into the present. She was still standing with her back to Preston, the phone in her hand, the letters R and E on the screen, her finger hovering over the D. But now, staring into Bea's eyes in that photo, Amy understood something. 4 years ago, she had run to save her daughter, but running hadn't solved anything. Tyler died, but the debt kept chasing her. Preston Whitmore still found her. Bea still wasn't safe. She'd been running her whole life, from poverty, from violence, from the past, from fear. And she was tired now. Tired of glancing over her shoulder to see who might be coming after her. Tired of waking up every night from nightmares. Tired of living in fear and teaching her daughter to live in fear. If she ran today, she would run forever. Bea would grow up with a mother who was always afraid, always hiding, always bowing her head to people with more power. Was that the mirror she wanted to be for her child? Amy erased the letters R and E, slipped the phone back into her coat pocket. She drew a deep breath, wiped the tears from her cheeks, and turned to face Preston Whitmore. He was still standing there with his victorious smile, pale blue eyes gleaming because he thought she was about to flee. But that smile died the moment he looked into Amy's eyes, because her blue eyes weren't afraid anymore. They were burning. "No," Amy said, her voice trembling but echoing through the silent room. Preston lifted an eyebrow, surprise flickering across his face. "No." "No to what?" "I said no," Amy repeated, each word like a stone thrown hard. "I'm not running anymore. I've been running my whole life, and I'm tired. I won't teach my daughter that bowing to bullies is how you survive." Murmurs began to rise around the table, and Amy saw surprise on the other representatives' faces. They hadn't expected a poor bakery worker to stand up to Preston Whitmore. Preston gave a short laugh, but it wasn't as confident as before. "You're brave, girl, but bravery won't save you." Amy stepped forward, each footfall a declaration. "You know a lot about me, Preston Whitmore. You know where I live, where my daughter goes to daycare. You even know the playground doesn't have cameras." She stopped right in front of him, blue eyes locked on his cold, pale ones. "But you know far too much about someone you met for the first time 10 minutes ago." She turned to the other representatives, her voice ringing through the room. "Mr. Blackwood had a medical emergency this morning. An ambush. 3 shooters. All Whitmore cartel." The murmurs grew louder, and Amy saw Preston's jaw tighten, his face flushing with rage. "And Preston Whitmore was prepared so well he could pull my entire background in just a few hours," Amy continued, stronger than she'd ever sounded. "As if he already knew I'd be here. As if he planned all of it." She stared straight into Preston's eyes, and for the first time she saw something there besides contempt. Worry, the anger of someone being exposed. "So," she said slowly, "the question is this. Who violated the neutral ground rules by attacking another boss right before this meeting?" Preston roared, his face turning so red it looked ready to explode. "You dare accuse me? A poor little debtor stands here and accuses Preston Whitmore." He stepped toward Amy with open menace, but before he could get close, another voice cut through the room, cold and sharp as a blade. "Father." Everyone turned toward the end of the table, where the woman Amy had seen in the lobby was rising to her feet. Sloane Whitmore, tall, long black hair spilling like a dark river, eyes sharp as razors, and a beauty so cold it was almost frightening. She wore a perfectly tailored black suit, and when she stood, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. "Shut up, Sloane," Preston snapped, never taking his eyes off Amy. "This isn't your business." "Like always," Sloane replied, her voice steady, untouched by her father's fury. "But this time, it's exactly my business." She stepped away from her chair and moved around the table with confident, fluid strides. Amy noticed the way the other representatives looked at Sloane, not with the contempt they'd shown Amy, but with respect, edged with caution. Sloane stopped in the center of the room, her gaze sweeping each person before settling on her father. "Miss, Thornton is right. This morning's ambush was real. 3 shooters, all our men, attacked Kieran Blackwood at 5 in the morning while he was on his way here." Preston stared at his daughter as if she'd betrayed him. "What do you know about this?" "I know everything, Father," Sloane said, her tone ice cold. "I've been tracking your operations for the last 6 months. I knew about the attack before it happened, and I know you broke the neutral ground rule that every family swore to honor." The murmurs rose louder, and Amy could see Preston's rage shifting into panic. He hadn't expected his daughter to turn on him in front of the other families. He hadn't expected his secret to be exposed by his own blood. "Sloane," Preston ground out, his voice dropping into a dangerous growl. "What are you doing?" "I'm doing the right thing, Father." Sloane turned to the other representatives, her voice carrying across the room. "I propose a vote. If my father is innocent, postponing the meeting for 24 hours won't hurt him. But if my father is involved in the attack, then you're sitting at this table with a man who broke the most sacred rule we have, the neutrality all our families built together over 50 years. Silence fell, heavy and tight. Amy stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for judgment from the most powerful people in the underworld. The first to speak was the old Marchetti, silver hair and sharp eyes fixed on Preston with undisguised disappointment. "The Marchetti family agrees to postpone." Next, one of the O'Sullivan brothers spoke, red hair and a cold smile. "The O'Sullivan family agrees to postpone." Finally, the Zhao representative, expressionless but decisive. "The Zhao family agrees to postpone." Preston stood there, his face going pale as if struck by lightning. He looked around the room, at the people he'd thought were allies turning their backs, at his daughter facing him with a cold gaze that held no regret. "You'll regret this," he roared, hatred thick in his voice. "All of you will regret today." Then he turned and stormed out, and when the heavy oak door slammed with a booming crash, Amy felt as if a massive stone had been lifted off her chest. The representatives began to rise, exchanging a few words before leaving the room one by one. Amy stood there, legs still shaking, not sure what she was supposed to do next. Then a hand touched her shoulder, and when Amy turned, Sloane was right behind her. "Wait," Sloane said, her voice much softer than it had been in the meeting. Amy stepped back, a reflex, her defenses still raw. "I need to get back to my daughter." "I know." Sloane nodded, and the sharpness in her eyes softened just slightly. "And she's safe." Amy froze, her heart racing. "How do you know that?" Sloane pulled a black business card with silver lettering from her pocket and handed it to Amy. "Because I sent someone to Happy Sunshine the moment you walked into that meeting room. I knew my father would use your daughter as leverage. He always does. That's how he controls people. He goes after what they love most." Amy stared at the card in her hand, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you helping me? You're Preston Whitmore's daughter." "That's exactly why I understand him better than anyone," Sloane said, and her voice carried a sadness Amy hadn't expected. "I've watched him destroy too many lives. I don't want to watch anymore." She looked straight into Amy's eyes, and for the first time Amy saw a real person behind the icy exterior. "Tell Blackwood to contact me. I want to end this war with peace, not blood." Amy nodded, gripping the card tight in her hand. "Thank you." Sloane gave a small, tired smile. "Don't thank me. You saved yourself when you decided not to run. I just made sure your daughter didn't have to pay for your courage." Amy didn't say anything else. She turned and ran out of the meeting room, out of the obsidian, and toward the place where her daughter was waiting. At 11:30, Amy burst into Happy Sunshine Daycare like a storm. She was still wearing the expensive dress, still balancing on sleek high heels, but she didn't care what she looked like anymore. She ran through the lobby, nearly colliding with a teacher carrying a stack of papers, cutting through hallways decorated with children's artwork and blinking Christmas lights. Her heart pounded wildly, not from running, but from the aching need to see her daughter, to touch her, to know that Bea was truly safe, and not just protected by the promise of a stranger. Miss Thornton, a staff member, recognized her and stared, startled by Amy's unfamiliar appearance. "What happened? Are you okay?" Amy didn't answer. She asked only one question, her voice trembling. "Where's Bea? Where's my daughter?" "Bea is in the playroom," the staff member said, worry plain on her face. "She's fine. Nothing happened." Amy didn't wait to hear anything else. She ran to the playroom, pushed the door wide open. The room was bright with color, with building blocks, dolls, tiny toy cars, and about a dozen children playing under the watch of two teachers. But Amy saw only one person. Bea was sitting in the corner, brown hair tied into two small braids, blue eyes focused on the picture she was drawing. She wore the little floral dress Amy had picked out that morning, and her angel face looked so peaceful Amy thought she might break. "Bee," Amy called, her voice thick. Bee looked up, and the moment those shining blue eyes saw her mother, her face lit up like the sun. "Mom." Bee jumped to her feet and ran to Amy on tiny legs, and Amy dropped to her knees and gathered her into her arms. She held her daughter as if she were afraid that if she let go, Bea would disappear. She breathed in the familiar scent of her child, baby shampoo mixed with crayons and candy, the scent of safety, of love, of the only things that truly mattered in her life. And then Amy cried. She couldn't stop it anymore. Tears poured out, soaking Bee's shoulder, and she didn't care. She cried from relief, from gratitude, from everything she'd been forced to carry in one morning, and now she could finally set it down. She cried because she'd almost lost everything, because she'd faced a monster and didn't run, because her daughter was still here, warm and alive in her arms. "Mom, are you crying?" Bea's worried voice whispered near Amy's ear, and Amy felt her daughter's small hand patting her back. "Does it hurt, Mom? Who made you cry?" Amy shook her head, unable to form words. She only hugged her tighter, as if she wanted to melt into this small body and never let go. Bea seemed to understand her mother needed the hug, so she didn't ask again. She just stood still in Amy's arms and lifted her little hand to wipe the tears from Amy's cheeks. "Don't cry, Mom," Bea whispered, her voice gentle as a tiny angel. "I'm here. I'll protect you." Amy let out a laugh through her tears, her heart melting at the love of a 5-year-old trying to be brave enough to comfort her mother. She eased back a little, looked into her daughter's clear blue eyes, and felt as if the whole world was okay as long as Bea was beside her. "I'm okay, sweetheart," Amy said, her voice still shaking. "I just missed you so much." Bea tilted her head, blue eyes studying her with innocent curiosity. "But you were only gone a little while. Why did you miss me so fast?" "Because you're my whole world, Bea," Amy whispered, kissing her forehead. "I miss you every second, every minute." Bea grinned, a smile that could chase every shadow out of Amy's life. "I missed you too. I drew you a picture, Mom. Want to see?" Amy nodded, and Bea ran to grab the drawing she'd been working on. While she waited, Amy glanced out the window and froze when she saw a man in a black suit standing outside the daycare gate. He stood perfectly still like a statue, eyes scanning the area with the alertness of someone trained for it. Sloane's man, Amy realized at once. She remembered what Sloane had said, that she'd sent someone to protect Bea the moment Amy stepped into that meeting room, which meant that man had been standing there for hours, guarding her daughter without Amy even knowing. Amy lifted a hand and gave a small nod toward him in thanks. He nodded back, a small gesture heavy with meaning, then turned and walked away, his job done. "Mom, look!" Bea ran back with the drawing in her hands, and Amy turned to her. The picture showed 3 people holding hands: a brown-haired woman, a brown-haired little girl, and a man with no face. Underneath were crooked letters: "My family." Amy pulled her daughter close, stared at the drawing, and felt a strange peace spread through her heart. For the first time that day, she felt like she could breathe. At 2 p.m, Finn picked Amy and Bea up from daycare and drove them to a villa in the suburbs. Amy didn't want to be away from her daughter for even a second, so when Finn said Kieran wanted to see her and hear the report, she insisted on bringing Bea with her. The house was a white 2-story building tucked behind tall trees, and the reinforced iron gate and cameras everywhere made it clear this place was heavily protected. Finn led them inside, down wide hallways with polished oak floors and expensive oil paintings on the walls. Bea held tightly to her mother's hand, clear blue eyes scanning the space with a mix of curiosity and fear. "It's so big, Mom," she whispered. "Who lives here?" "A friend of mine," Amy answered, even though she wasn't sure she could call Kieran a friend. They stopped in front of a large wooden door, and Finn knocked twice before opening it. Inside was a spacious sitting room with a fire burning in the hearth, warm light flickering over wood-paneled walls. Kieran lay on a long sofa, white bandages still wrapped around his side, his face paler than it had been that morning, but his gray eyes still sharp as steel. "Doctor." Bennett sat in a chair nearby, checking an IV bag connected to Kieran's arm. When he saw Amy step in, Kieran tried to sit up, even as Bennett motioned against it. Kieran's gray eyes moved over her from head to toe, not judging, but as if he were checking whether she'd been hurt. And the first thing he asked wasn't about the meeting, wasn't about Preston, wasn't about the vote. "Are you okay?" Amy blinked, startled by the question. She'd prepared herself to report like an employee standing in front of a boss, ready to recount every detail of the confrontation with Preston Whitmore. She hadn't expected the first thing Kieran cared about to be her, not the result. "I'm okay," she answered, her voice catching. Then she began telling him everything, from the moment she entered the Obsidian, to facing Preston, to being threatened with B, to almost running, to choosing to stay and strike back. She told him about Sloane, about the vote, about the unexpected win, and about the business card Preston's daughter had given her along with an offer of peace. Kieran listened in silence, gray eyes never leaving her. When Amy reached the part where she'd almost texted Red to Finn but chose not to run, she saw something shift in Kieran's gaze. Surprise, maybe. Or admiration. "You stood up to Preston Whitmore," Kieran said slowly when she finished, and his voice held something she couldn't name. "With your daughter being threatened, with everything stacked against you, and you didn't run." Amy looked down at B, who stood pressed against her leg, small hand gripping the fabric of her dress. "I ran once already. Running didn't fix anything." Kieran studied her for a long moment, then spoke softly. "You're the most extraordinary person I've ever met, Amy." Before Amy could respond, B suddenly spoke, her small voice full of worry. "Mom, is he hurt?" Kieran lowered his gaze, looking directly at the 5-year-old standing beside Amy for the first time, and immediately B stepped back, hiding behind her mother, blue eyes wide with fear. Amy felt her daughter tremble behind her, and she understood. B was afraid of men. She'd seen her father hit her mother. She'd lived in fear for the first 3 years of her life, and even though Tyler had been dead for 2 years, that fear was still carved deep into her instincts. Kieran understood it too. He didn't try to move closer. He didn't try to talk directly to her. Instead, he slowly lowered himself down and sat on the floor instead of the sofa, making himself smaller, less threatening. Then he sat there quietly, not looking straight at B, but at the fire in the hearth, giving her space and time to get used to him being there. "Hello, little one," he said gently, his voice softer than Amy had ever heard it. "Your mom was very brave today." B didn't answer. She stayed behind Amy, but her blue eyes had started to watch Kieran with curiosity instead of pure fear. And in Kieran's mind, memory began to pour in. 24 years ago, in Mrs. Rosa's tiny apartment, a skinny 12-year-old boy sat curled in the corner, eyes down, too afraid to look at the stranger who'd just saved him. Mrs. Rosa didn't force him to talk. She didn't question him about his past. She didn't try to hug him or soothe him. She simply placed a warm loaf of bread in front of him, then sat down nearby. "Not too close, not too far. You don't have to say anything, mijo," she said, her voice as warm as bread fresh from the oven. "You just have to know someone cares about you." It was the first time since his mother died that Kieran felt loved. Not because Mrs. Rosa gave him food and shelter, but because she gave him space to heal, gave him the patience no one else ever had. Back in the present, Kieran looked at B, still hiding behind Amy, and he understood this child needed time, the way he'd once needed time. He didn't rush her. He didn't push. He simply sat there, quiet and patient, letting B decide when she was ready. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Then B timidly stepped out from behind her mother, blue eyes studying Kieran with cautious curiosity. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, a little," Kieran answered, still not looking straight at her so he wouldn't scare her. B stood there for a moment, as if thinking something through. Then she ran to the small backpack Amy had brought from daycare, rummaged inside, and pulled out a cookie. The cookie was misshapen, probably made by B in class, its shape unclear and the frosting spread unevenly. "For you," B said, shyly holding it out toward Kieran. "Teacher said eating cookies makes pain go away." Kieran looked at the cookie in the child's hand, and for a moment he saw himself in B's place 24 years ago, offering Mrs. Rosa a wildflower he'd picked from the roadside. He reached out carefully and took the crooked cookie as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "Thank you," he said, his voice tightening. Then he brought it to his mouth and took a bite, even if it probably didn't taste good, even if the dough was slightly raw and the frosting too sweet. "It's delicious," B beamed, the first smile she'd given a strange man since Tyler died. And Amy stood there watching her daughter smile at the formidable man who held the fate of thousands in his hands, feeling her heart stir in a way she'd never known. That evening, Amy kept her pinky promise to her daughter. She took Bee to the city's central square, where the Christmas Lights Festival was blazing with thousands of shimmering points of light. Red, green, gold, white. Colors dancing on pine branches, on rooftops, on streets dusted with fake snow. Bee darted through the sea of lights, her bright gaze catching every glow like two sparkling gems, and her bright laughter rang through the cold air like the sweetest Christmas song. Amy stood watching her child, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Just this morning, she'd been kneeling on the cold floor of the bakery, bandaging a bleeding stranger. Just hours ago, she'd been facing a monster in a meeting room on the 50th floor, with her daughter threatened and her whole world ready to collapse. But now she was standing here, surrounded by Christmas lights, watching Bee laugh and spin, and it all felt like a dream. The phone in her pocket vibrated. Amy pulled it out and looked at the screen. A message from the number she'd saved as K. Does Bee like the Christmas lights? Thank you for reminding me there are still good people in this world. Amy smiled and typed a short reply. She loves them, and thank you for giving me the chance to keep my promise to her. She slipped the phone away just as Bee ran back to her, cheeks rosy from the cold, holding cotton candy shaped like a little pine tree, a gift from a kind vendor. Mom, Bee asked, tilting her face up, blue eyes clear and bright. Do you believe in miracles? Amy looked at her daughter, at the lights glittering all around them, and thought about everything that had happened today. She thought about the stranger bleeding in the dark alley, about the crazy decision not to walk away, about the room full of monsters and the moment she chose not to run anymore. She thought about Sloane, the daughter who turned on her father to do what was right, about Kieran, the Mafia boss trying to make up for the wrongs of his past. And she thought about Bee, her little angel, who'd offered a crooked cookie to a stranger and earned the first smile from those cold gray eyes. Yes, sweetheart, Amy said, kneeling to pull her daughter into her arms. I believe in miracles. 6 months later, summer arrived with bright golden sun and birdsong outside the window. Sweet Haven was no longer the tiny bakery where Amy used to work. It had doubled in size, with a new glossy sign that read, Sweet Haven Bakery and Cafe. Amy was now a co-owner with Maggie, and they'd hired 5 more employees, all women who'd been through hard things the way Amy had. She wanted to give them the chance she'd been given, the chance to stand up and begin again. The $47,000 debt was gone. Preston Whitmore had been removed by the other families after evidence of the ambush, and many other crimes came to light. Sloane had taken over the Whitmore cartel and was slowly converting it into a legitimate business organization, partnering with Blackwood Holdings in a historic peace agreement. Amy and Bee had moved into a new apartment in a safer neighborhood, with a bedroom just for Bee and a window that looked out onto a park filled with flowers. Bee was 6 now, about to start 1st grade, and she wasn't afraid of strange men anymore. The bell above the bakery door rang, and Amy looked up from a pile of accounting books. When she saw who was walking in, her heart began to beat faster. Kieran Blackwood stood in the doorway, tall and handsome in a white dress shirt and black slacks, no longer wearing the cold, dangerous aura of the Mafia boss she'd met 6 months ago. He looked healthy, confident, and there was a smile on his mouth as he looked at her. But before Amy could say anything, a small storm burst from behind the counter. Uncle Kieran. Bee ran like a bullet, slammed into Kieran's legs, and hugged him tight. Kieran laughed, lifted her up, and spun her in a circle. My little princess. You're getting so big, Bee giggled, blue eyes glittering. You came to see me. Did you bring candy? Kieran set Bee down and pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket. I always do. Amy stepped closer, smiling at the scene. You're early. Kieran looked up at her, gray eyes warm in a way she'd grown used to over the last 6 months. I've got good news. The deal with Sloane is finished. Blackwood Holdings is fully legitimate now. No more Mafia, Amy asked, a teasing edge in her voice. Just a boring corporate CEO now, Kieran said, smiling too. Amy laughed. You can't be boring. Kieran looked at her, his gaze holding something she'd learned to recognize in the past months. Have you thought about my offer? What offer? Amy pretended not to understand, even as her heart hammered. Both of them. But first, would you have dinner with me? Bee jumped in, tugging on her mother's hand. Mom, say yes. Uncle Kieran always buys me ice cream. Amy looked at her daughter, looked at Kieran, and felt a strange peace spread through her chest. Okay, but you're paying. I think I can handle it. Kieran laughed. Bee squealed with delight. Ice cream first. The three of them walked out of the bakery, late afternoon sun spilling down like warm honey. Bee walked between them, one hand in her mother's, the other in Kieran's, skipping like a little bird. Amy glanced at Kieran and saw the way he was watching Bee, a look she'd never seen in anyone, the look of someone who'd found something he hadn't known he was searching for. And Amy understood that sometimes miracles do exist. They say the devil has no heart. They were wrong. Sometimes a heart is simply waiting for the right person to wake it up. And sometimes that person is a baker with rough hands and a pinky promise to her little girl. This is a story about second chances, for a boss who wanted redemption, for a mother who wanted freedom, and for a little girl who believed miracles were real. This story reminds us that no matter how deep life pushes us, no matter how painful the past is, there's always a chance to stand up, to change, to love, and to be loved. Sometimes all we need is the courage not to run, to face our fear, and to open our hearts to the wonders life can bring. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share it with the people you love. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss more moving stories every day. We'd love to know how you feel about this story. Have you ever faced a moment when you wanted to run, but you chose to stay and face it? Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance? Share with us in the comments below. We always want to hear what's in your heart. Thank you for taking the time to watch today's story. We wish you and your family good health, happy days, and peace in every moment. Remember, no matter how hard life gets, miracles still exist if you dare to believe and dare to hope. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.